Thank you for joining us today for the third and final part of the COSE WebEd Series, Ship Smart and Save Money, presented by Ascent Global Logistics. Before we get started, I would like to present our speaker, Aaron Brott, Vice President of Strategic Sales at Ascent Global Logistics. To ask Aaron questions throughout the presentation, please use the chat feature, which is located on the right panel of the WebEx screen. Aaron, over to you.
Good morning. Thank you again for joining our seminar today. On our agenda, we'll talk about the 12 key steps to international shipping, some additional areas where Ascent can help, and some final thoughts on what I would like to call avoiding surprises. So for today's discussion, we will be talking about the individual steps for international shipping, specifically focusing on imports into the U.S. There are 12 key steps that I will outline, and I will discuss some of the differences between importing into the U.S. and exporting into the U.S., but the process itself from a high level is very similar across both import and export. Typically, as you're either shipping import and export from the U.S. To offshore, you'll either be using ocean or air, and depending on where you're shipping to, typically the ocean transit times could be 30 to 35 days. Air shipments could be 7 to 10 days. Again, depends on where you're shipping to, where the country is, where you're importing into, so those transit times could vary. So let's take a look at the first part of any international shipping. And really, it all starts with the terms agreed upon between the buyer and seller. And this specifically, again, is for the importing process into the U.S. Terms are typically agreed on, what item is to be purchased, the color, the size, and so forth. They agree on the cost of the item, and then the buyer and seller agrees upon Incoterms, which are international commercial terms. And those terms are really used to primarily communicate who is responsible for specific charges in the shipment once that shipment is underway into the U.S. Mode of transportation is typically defined at this stage too as well. It all depends on how quickly you need the product, whether it moves air or ocean. Banking terms, if you have credit or have to move on letter of credit, those are typically defined in the terms of agreed upon between the buyer and the seller. Once the terms are completed, the order is awarded and initiated. The buyer will then send a PO to the vendor or the seller. The order confirmation is received and then is sent back to the buyer to say, yes, we've received it. We agree with the purchase order, and then they'll start the process. I've just got a question that just came in. Where can I find additional information regarding Incoterms? The International Chamber of Commerce, ICCWBO.org website, has a tremendous amount of information regarding Incoterms. It also gives a nice pictorial of the specific terms, what they mean, and the risk associated with that. We also have that website at the end of this presentation as well. Very, very important website to look at as you're shipping internationally, because those terms are used globally. So the buyer and seller can communicate effectively regarding the international terms. Steps 3 through 5, once the agreement is made and the order is placed, the ready date is agreed upon. Again, if you are the buyer, you'll have a specific ready date that maybe you'll need to have in order to import the shipment into the U.S. and get to your end customer. The manufacturing occurs. Sometimes the buyer can have visibility into that manufacturing process, of what we call WIP, or work in progress, so you'll be able to track where your order is throughout that process. Once it's done, the shipment is ready for export, and then the buyer is typically notified that the shipment is ready and has been manufactured. From there, the vendor contacts the buyer or freight forwarder. And typically what we see is once that shipment is done, a notification will go to both. And depending on the terms of sale, it could be the vendor freight forwarder that is contacted, or it could be the buyer's freight forwarder that's contacted at the origin location. And typically it doesn't matter. Somebody at the origin location will be notified, and that communication will go downstream to the buyer. And once that notification happens, then the buyer will start in the U.S. will start working with their U.S. customs broker to notify them that the shipment is ready for shipment and they should be expecting documentation. The freight forwarder then arranges booking with the carrier. It's really like reserving a seat on an aircraft. The cargo will get booked with an ocean vessel or an aircraft, depending on the mode of transportation. They will assign space to that particular shipment at the time they're ready. Just got another question that came in. It says, how can I ensure proper procedures are followed at origin, specifically on the communication between the vendor and the origin office? With any international shipping, whether it be import or export, the customer should work with their elected freight forwarder to develop a standard operating procedure. And that standard operating procedure really outlines the communication pieces of that particular transaction, as well as notified parties, documentation required, and any expectation that the importer has for that particular shipment. That document is a living, breathing document that changes as your business changes. So it should not be something that you do once. It should be something that's kind of reviewed throughout the year and years as you move forward and you're working with that particular vendor. Once the notification and the booking is made, the cargo is delivered to the seaport or airport. Sometimes the vendor will require specific equipment to be delivered to their site, so they can either load the container or load the truck for the air shipment as well. The freight forwarder prepares the bill of lading once the cargo is there, and then the information is sent to the notified party, typically the U.S. Customs broker. So once the bill of lading is prepared, the documentations are sent to the customs broker in the U.S. to notify them and pre-alert them that the shipment is on its way. That documentation is also typically given to the importer of record or the buyer at that point. The ISF is completed for U.S. imports and AES is completed for U.S. exports. From an international shipping process perspective, these are two big differences. Customs broker submits documentation for customs clearance, and really this is, as I indicated on the first slide, steps 9 through 12 really happen very quickly and can happen in different orders. But the customs broker submits that once the documentation is ready and the shipment gets a specific place in the supply chain. Another question that just came through, what is ISF? It is an international security filing, or commonly known as 10+2. It has to do with the security and customs borders and protection require 10 data elements plus 2 additional data elements prior to that container loading on the vessel for shipment security purposes. Steps 10 through 12 is, if we look at the arrival in the destination country and the customs broker is notified, as I said previously, 9 through 12 really happen very, very quickly. The customs broker is typically notified once the shipment is on the water. They have the documentation and they're working to prepare the customs entry. They can actually submit that documentation 5 days prior to that vessel hitting port, or 4 hours after wheels up if it's an air shipment. So they can start submitting that to U.S. Customs. They submit it through ABI. Once Customs reviews that, they either will clear that electronically, or they will require what they'll call docs required, so U.S. Customs will take a look at the documentation. What that allows is once that shipment is cleared and that vessel hits port or that aircraft lands, that freight can be recovered and delivered in a timely fashion. Now, sometimes what happens is U.S. Customs will require to inspect it. When that happens is once the cargo is discharged from the vessel, they will put it into an in-bond storage area for Customs to inspect, and then once they have been satisfied with what they're looking for, they'll go ahead and clear the shipment, and then you can recover it. The shipment is typically cleared and duties and taxes are paid. Duties and taxes are paid 10 days after that shipment, so that we call that liquidation. So that's required by U.S. Customs that you actually pay duties on that within 10 days after that hits after that shipment is cleared. And you can do it one of two ways. The customs broker can forward that money on your behalf, or you can have an automated clearinghouse, which is essentially a bank account where they can pull those duties and taxes on. Very important from an importing perspective is document retention, and even on the export side, but specifically on the import side, the document retention is 5 years. And the document packet includes the 7501, which is essentially the clearance from U.S. Customs, as well as the packing list, the bill of lading, the invoice, all associated documents with that. Now, some customers will say, well, my customs broker has all that information. By law, the importer of record has to retain those documentation. Now, you can request approval from U.S. Customs to have your either your customs broker retain those for you, but you have to have approval first. So additional areas where we can help, I go back to the standard operating procedure, specifically at origin. We can help develop those SOPs so the communication piece is very clear between vendor, origin office, and destination office. We'll go through a pre-booking checklist. We also talk about cargo insurance because there is risk anytime you move a shipment, no matter if it's international or domestically. But cargo insurance is an important piece of that international shipment. Now, with classification of goods, also the customs clearance process and duty payment, and working with you to obtain a customs bond. We also have a documentation compliance and record retention program that we can walk you through and make sure that you're in compliance with U.S. Customs. And also on the final delivery steps, are very key, whether that's going to your facility specifically or to your end customer. As I stated in slide 2, the Incoterms, you can find that information at iccwbo.org. Very important to review that information. Sometimes your Chamber of Commerce, your local Chamber of Commerce or World Trade Organization will have Incoterm seminars. If those are very good to attend to get a better understanding of those terms. Some final thoughts in what I'd like to call avoiding surprises, and it really boils down to, when you look at each one of these points, is communication. I know I've said a couple of times about establishing standard operating procedures. That is key because that really dictates the communication piece for your international shipping and the expectations that you have for not only the vendor but the freight forwarder themselves. I would also be aware of any government holidays or anything that's moving or happening in a specific country that you're either sourcing from or shipping to. Sometimes there's labor strikes. Sometimes there's political opportunities there that could potentially delay shipments. Also monitor the steamship lines and airlines for delays, whether it be weather, space, equipment. Those are all parts of the international shipping process that if you take the time up front to really understand some of the challenges in specific countries, your international shipping process will be very, very, very smooth. So at this time, again, it was a very high-level overview of international shipping. If there's any questions, we can go ahead and take those. Okay. With that ends our presentation for today. If you have any questions or additional needs, please look us up on the web at info.ascentglobal.com or call us at 1-800-614-1348. Thank you again for your time, and have a great day.